Okay, I think it's 11 o'clock, so it's a good time to start. Once again, good morning to our listeners. Welcome to this LinkedIn event under the title of Forum Washington to Brussels, Trump's Victory and the Future of US and EU Foreign Policy. My name is Giuseppe Spatafora, and I'm the analyst for transatlantic relations at the European Union Institute for Security Studies. And let me briefly introduce my fellow colleagues who will be speaking today. We have with us, in the order in which they will speak, Tim Rühlich, who's the senior analyst for Global China, Bojana Zoric, who's the analyst for the Western Balkans, and Joris Ster, who's the analyst for Economic Security and Technology. We're very glad to be here to speak with you about this, one of the key events of 2024 that will certainly shape foreign policy in 2025. As you know, on November 5th, the US citizens re-elected Donald Trump as their 47th president after a long campaign that was in many ways unprecedented, featuring assassination attempts, candidate shifts, legal troubles, and so on. Now, the election has finished. The voters have made their choice clear, but the consequences of that choice will reach well beyond Washington, D.C., and well beyond the US borders. They will affect basically the entirety of the world. They will affect the European Union, and they will affect all aspects of EU foreign policy. So in this LinkedIn event, we, as EUISS analysts, will try to reckon with the effects of this new presidency on key areas of European foreign and security policy. We will think about the strategic dilemmas that the EU and its member states will face when dealing with the new administration in Washington, and we will suggest courses of action to navigate transatlantic relations and preserve European security and the security of our neighborhood. Let me just say that this discussion will draw on a commentary series that we are currently publishing. It's also called From Washington to Brussels. It's available on our website, and we encourage you all to check it out. Now, before proceeding, let me share a couple of housekeeping notes. Each of us will present the key implications of Trump's victory for their area of expertise in around 5 to 10 minutes, and then we will also discuss the key actions that we think the EU should take to address these implications. And then towards the end, we will have about 15 minutes for questions. So I would like to ask you to please start thinking about your questions while the analysts speak. Write them down in the chat, and then we will I will be distributing the questions to our analysts, and we'll make sure to give you a satisfactory answer. And then we will wrap up at 12 o'clock noon Brussels time. So with that in mind, let me kickstart the discussion. I will speak briefly, highlighting the key features of US foreign policy under Trump 2.0, and the features that the EU will need to deal with and interact with. And I will mostly focus on transatlantic relations as a whole, but with a specific focus on the policy towards Ukraine and European defense. So what does Trump mean for the EU? I think that we can discuss 4 features right now that are relevant for the EU. One, the first feature is that Trump will be similar to his first term, but will also be less restrained and more in control. You remember in 2017 to 2021, Trump was constrained by the Republican advisors and the traditional foreign policy establishment. And this basically constrained some of his instinct and some of his foreign policy choices. But this time around, Trump is clearly in control of his party. He will be surrounded by loyalists, as you've seen. Lots of cabinet appointments so far reward loyalty to Trump over these troublesome periods. And there will be less hurdles for him to accomplish his goals. So basically, Trump has a certain agenda, America First agenda, will try to implement it. And this means that there might be serious tensions in the transatlantic relationship, but this is something that needs to be factored in. A second point is that Trump's foreign policy will be guided by some of the mantras, including the mantra of peace through strength, the assertion of American military might as a way of dissuading war. But Trump also has a long-term goal of ending the so-called forever wars, But in this case, it is sort of shifted because now Trump talks about ending Biden's wars, by which he means the war that started under the Biden administration, and that Trump claims are the fault of this administration. This has implication, obviously, for the conflict in Ukraine, for Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. As you know, Trump has pledged to resolve the conflict quickly by negotiating a deal with Russia and with Ukraine, and it's unlikely that, or it's a question whether the Europeans will be consulted in the process. At the same time, Trump has criticized American support to Ukraine, and he has pledged to end it. But there is also a possibility that he might just reduce it or change it, for instance, make it conditional on Ukraine accepting negotiations. And since the relevance of this conflict for Europe is fundamental, this is an area in which the EU will need to act quickly to potentially fill in for the US withdrawal. Now, another key threat of Trump that the EU will need to deal with is transactionalism, especially his approach to traditional allies. So Trump does not feel, or the Trump administration will likely not feel loyalty to traditional alliances, as it has happened in the past, but clearly now it's very prominent. It is not about maintaining the commitment to traditional allies and democracies. But it also doesn't mean that the US will not work with allies at all. It actually, at least in my reading, means that the US will work with allies who contribute significantly to their own security, and also they take care of theaters that the US deems secondary. There's a lot of emphasis in the Trump foreign policy and the security circles that there will be a focus on the Indo-Pacific, on China. And consequently, Europe becomes clearly a secondary theater. This ties with Trump's past criticism of NATO and his threat not to defend allies that do not spend enough on defense. Generally, also a potential threat to withdraw assets from Europe and move them to theaters such as the Indo-Pacific. Obviously, this would create issues for European defense. It would create holes in European deterrence, something that the Europeans would need to immediately fill. And generally, we also should be assured that Russia will try to exploit those vulnerabilities. So this is something, again, to keep in mind. And one last feature that I want to mention is uncertainty and unpredictability. Trump makes a lot of decisions based on his businessman instinct. He believes that his personality will push foreign leaders to reach agreements, and for that reason, he doesn't want to disclose the strategy will adopt. This means that it's very hard to know what he will actually want to do. For instance, if we return back to the potential Ukraine deal, there are some assumptions that it will entail recognition of the territories that Russia has occupied as part of Russia itself, and potentially imposing neutrality on Ukraine. But the question is, first of all, we don't know whether this is likely to happen, and more importantly, we don't know whether Putin would agree with these terms, because if Trump is committed to peace, and he might well be committed to peace, we know that Putin is not committed to peace. He's committed to continuing the war that is now part of a key component of his government. And therefore, this opens other questions. What will the US do if Russia does not want to come to the table, or if it refuses the agreement? What will the US do then? Will it just disengage for Ukraine and lose interest, or will it double down on support? This is really question mark for unpredictability that we need to take into account. So in general, transatlantic issues will be hard to navigate, and the EU will need to straddle a fine line between, on the one hand, continuing the transatlantic bond, ensuring that the United States remains a good ally for Europe, and at the same time, it will need to assume more responsibility and act independently, as if Washington wasn't there. And I think that this is a hard line, but it is something that can be done with the right commitment and with the right resources. So let me just conclude with some policy recommendations that are dealt with in detail in the commentaries. But the bottom line is that Europe will need more resources. It needs to deliver on the key goals of competitiveness, of defending Europe, and that will mean a significant increase of resources. Without those, it will not be possible to carry out that ambitious plan. It will not be possible simply to defend Europe. Second key point that I suggest is that the Europeans map out the likely courses of action and changes in US foreign policy and the strategic dilemmas that creates. And that happens before those changes take place, and they prepare the clear response to those. An example, again, is if the United States withdraws some form of assistance to Ukraine, if not in the entirety, the EU must have a clear plan on how to pitch in and how to calm the gulf that will create if American support is withdrawn. What can it do with partners? What can it do on its own? This will be important to be done immediately. Another suggestion is that the EU reach out directly to the new administration and proposes with a proactive approach to certain action without waiting for the administration to carry out unilateral decision. For instance, moving assets from Europe to the Indo-Pacific. And that will leave the EU without some key assets. How can the EU prevent it? I don't know if it can prevent it, but it can show credibility by going to Washington and say that the Europeans will commit to spending more, even preempting some of Trump's demand, and that they will focus on building some of the assets that the US feels are in short supply and that they are needed for other regions of the world, such as the mainland US or the Indo-Pacific. And that will show credibility and would make it more amenable for the US to come to work with Europe. I would just like to add that I think that there is a great opportunity for this administration, for the Trump administration, to support European action on defense. As long as the Europeans spend on defense, the new administration will like it. The last point is that the EU must work with partners. We are not the only ones that are concerned about a new presidency. There are allies across the world that are concerned about US disengagement, about changing of priorities, about isolationism. And it's a great opportunity for all of them to come together and provide a unified voice towards Washington. Allies in the Indo-Pacific, the UK, NATO, Canada, these are all actors that could come together. And there needs to be obviously an approach to those countries that are less aligned, that are hedging, but are also concerned about shifts in US foreign policy. Well, let me stop here and turn to my colleagues. I would like to start with Tim, who has just published a piece for our commentary series. It's called Trade, Tech, and Taiwan, Crafting a Transatlantic Agenda on China. So obviously the focus on China will be key for the US. The US are always seeing eye to eye with DC on this file. So Tim, what can we expect and what should we do?
Thanks a lot, Giuseppe, for inviting me into this FastTech panel. I'm really excited to be here along with you, with Bojana, and with EUISS. It's a great pleasure. And thank you so much for all the viewers for joining us today. I mean, you already hinted, Giuseppe, at the fact that Trump is quite unpredictable, and now you're still asking me to predict what's going to come. I'll try my very best. Well, who knows? I mean, I think what complicates the issue in the case of China is that Trump himself, I think, has two intuitions or two beliefs that are kind of contradictory when it comes to China. But to start with, I think sort of the environment in which he finds himself is a broad, in this case, even bipartisan consensus in Washington, D.C., that China is an existential threat to the United States, a perspective that may or may not be shared in the EU, in Europe. But we are certainly not as clear about China being an existential threat as both Democrats and Republicans are, including the key aides that he has named to lead his China policy, plus a bipartisan consensus in Washington that Europe is too slow and too indecisive to tackle jointly that existential threat. And that sort of as an environment is, of course, quite challenging from the start before we even consider the Trump factor. Now, on top of that, the Trump factor. What are the two intuitions or two beliefs that I had just referred to? On the one hand, for Trump, China is, in a way, a country like any other. And that is sort of very much contrasting with this Washington consensus. And that is because, as you mentioned already, Giuseppe, he does not really believe in alliances. He is not the democracy versus autocracy type of person, but he wants to strike deals He wants to be pragmatic and transactionalist. He even admires strong leaders like President Xi Jinping. So he may be inclined to just say, well, it's not so much of an existential threat here. I just call this guy. I try to pull it off with him. I try to make good short-term deals for the United States here. So in that way, China could be treated really like any other country in a way. That could mean trade deal. It could also mean that he is sort of more transactional on questions related to Taiwan. Now, that is a bit of a nightmare scenario for the EU, because consider he would try to bring as much leverage against China as possible. So he would try to align with the EU on pressuring China, cornering China, getting sort of more power and more bargaining power towards the Chinese. But once he has cornered China, he would then try to get the best out of it for the US, and then sort of throwing the EU under the bus. So in the worst case, if he follows that intuition, we first help him to then just get a very good deal for the United States and not for us. The second intuition, however, that Trump has is quite the opposite. He's focused, he's almost obsessed with the trade balance, the trade deficit that the United States still has with China. And of course, he's also at times sort of mentioning China, singling out it as a peer competitor. So with this Make America Great Again, putting America at the center, you could also say, well, China is the only peer competitor that he needs to worry about. So he could also be following the intuition of his aides, of the Washington consensus, and very much double down on it. The problem there for Europe could be that he may be really outpacing the EU without caring about us. So he may just impose enormous restrictions that aim to target China, but then also have secondary effects on us. So that could be export controls that don't just affect US companies, but also ours. Or he could condition market access to the US market and consider all of a sudden European products, Chinese products, because we rely on China in some form of the supply chain before. So whatever intuition it is, it comes at least with severe risks. Now, where's sort of the positive part and what should we do? And let me conclude with that. I think this sort of distinction or this tension between the both Atlantic partners here contrasts with a growing convergence. If you look at the political guidelines that Commission President von der Leyen has just put out, you will find plenty of wording that more or less aligns, at least more than before, with the US perspective on China. If you listen to the hearing of the incoming HR VP Kaja Kallas in the European Parliament, you can see that she referred to China as a competitor and a systemic rival. That is, I think, also really strong language, and putting sort of the cooperation part or the partnership element a bit to the side. So we do see that convergence. And also, you said my piece in the commentary series is called Trade, Tech, Taiwan. These are indeed, I think, the three T's, the three buckets where cooperation is possible, where we do have an overlap of concerns and of policies. And let me spend one sentence on each of them. Trade. We are very concerned, both sides on the Atlantic, very concerned about the overcapacity that China is producing. So we have a weak domestic demand in China, but still high subsidies, so a high industrial manufacturing output. And the result is that a lot of cheap manufactured goods get to global markets, and thereby distorting the competitiveness of our economies. And the EU has proposed to develop what they call economic security standards within the G7, so also with the United States, to tackle exactly that problem. That could be a very good entry point to tackle it jointly. On technology, we are both very concerned about a number of developments in the competitive realm of technology that implies mostly or focuses mostly on economic security, and also aspects of leakage of technology that strengthens the capabilities of the People's Liberation Army, so the Chinese army. There's, I think, also ample room to share information, share intelligence, identify shared priorities, and adapt similar policy measures to counter that. And finally, Taiwan. It is a bit open how Trump approaches that, but indeed, if he goes tough on Taiwan, I think the EU will not completely follow him. But we see, again, in the political guidelines, the EU for the first time speaking of the goal to deter China from forcefully, so militarily changing the status quo in the Taiwan Strait. It is putting in place something that we call the preparedness agenda, crisis preparedness agenda, that very much resonates with a whole of society approach that the Taiwanese are taking at the moment. So there is some convergence, even if I don't think that we will see the shipment of weaponry from Europe to Taiwan, but there is some room to deepen indeed sort of the cooperation with Taiwan and thereby also sort of aligning a bit more with the US agenda. Final sentence here, I think whatever we put forward and trying to go forward with the United States need to come very quickly and in European unity, because what Washington is really fed up with is that we are slow and that they're hearing 5 different opinions from Europe. So I think if we want to be taken serious, we have to act fast, swiftly. We need to make sure we are not outpaced by the United States. And we have to be very clear, well, that's a European offer, and you don't have to call Brussels plus 5 capitals of member states to understand the different approaches. The Trump team just will not show the patience. And frankly, the Democrats may have also not done so if they had won this election. Leaving it here and looking forward to the discussion. Thank you, Giuseppe, and back to you.
Thank you, Tim, for this very sharp and crisp comments. Very interesting and very engaging. Now, we've discussed China as obviously a key issue for both the US and the EU, but let me turn to Bojana now, who's the expert on the Western Balkans. And this is a way to showcase that the US election, even though did not talk about all issues of the world, will affect many areas of the world, in particular an area such as the Western Balkans, which is such an important neighbor for the European Union. And Bojana itself has written a commentary called The Western Balkans and Trump 2.0. What should the EU hope for and fear? And now we will hear from her on the changes that the new administration could bring to this region and how that impacts both the countries in the region and the EU. Bojana, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Giuseppe, and both Tim and you actually provided an excellent broader context of the main challenges, and I'll try to narrow it a bit down for the Western Balkans. So I would start by saying that the US foreign policy in the Western Balkans had 2 major victories over the past 3 decades. The first, it was the 1995 Dayton Agreement, which of course ended the Bosnian War. It was a major European, but also American diplomatic victory. And the second was the US-led NATO intervention in 1999 that helped to halt humanitarian catastrophe that was then unfolding and prevent further Serbian aggression. So basically, it is America's military assets and footprint in the Western Balkans that makes it today a credible actor in the region. And whatever local leaders and politicians thought about American action, they do take it seriously. And let me just name a recent example from the last year. Just days after the Banska attack in September 2023, the NSC Intelligence Directorate exposed Serbia's military buildup, including tanks, mechanized infantry, etc. And this disclosure actually spurred European countries to join the US in applying diplomatic pressure. And within days, we saw Serbian forces withdrawing. And this was, in a way, a move that highlighted America's critical crisis management role, I would say, in the region. So beyond this NATO strategic and military commitment, the US engagement remains strong due to rising foreign influence in the region. We've seen Kremlin-backed war propaganda that is spreading, but also China's asymmetric economic dependency that is turning in a strategic liability. So as long as foreign meddling persist, the US involvement will very highly likely to continue, just as it did under the first Trump and also Biden administration. And here the real challenge lies in keeping the US and European interests aligned. And when talking about the outcomes of the elections and challenges for the region, we've already discussed, and you said that Trump 2.0 administration will be laser focused on mounting competition with China and Indo-Pacific. And this means actually Western Balkans staying on geopolitical sidelines. And even if Kamala Harris had taken the office, this priority would have remained the same. But nonetheless, I argue that there are still a few potential risks to anticipate with the incoming administration. First, you both as well mentioned transactional economic policy. An ever-growing emphasis on economic policy has emerged from President-elect Trump's inner circle, even during the Biden's years. We've seen Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump securing deals in Albania for a luxury complex worth over $1 billion. Just recently this year, Jared Kushner brokered an agreement with President Vučić to develop a luxury hotel in Belgrade that is going to be built on the site of the former Yugoslav Ministry of Defense. It's valued at $500 million. So basically, such lucrative business deals could compromise U.S. interests because they would prioritize economic interests over political consideration, and they would potentially tip the scale in favor of Serbia and maybe not other countries in the region. The second potential risk is all about what I call emboldening strongmen and the liberal tendencies. Here, the risk is that Donald Trump's cabinet members could amplify nationalist rhetoric in the region, particularly vis-a-vis the most recently adopted 13-page All-Serbian Declaration that was adopted by Serbia and Republika Srpska. And basically, this document outlines an aggressive vision for regional dominance, including plans to undermine Bosnia and Herzegovina's sovereignty and also reclaim parts of Kosovo. And this declaration is very reminiscent of the concept of a Srpski svet, or Serbian world, that seeks to unite Serbs across the region, not necessarily through territorial expansion, but at the very least by consolidating Serbian political, cultural influence over neighboring countries. And again, this term bears similarities to Moscow's concept that we all know of Russian world or Ruski Mir. So in this potential scenario, a former Trump U.S. envoy for Belgrade-Pristina dialogue, Richard Grenell, might again be the driving force behind the U.S. Western Balkans policy. He's known to be a friend of Serbia. He's a recipient of the Order of the Serbian Flag in 2023, and he was also a person who dismissed the U.S. intelligence on Serbian troop movements near the Kosovo border as a phony last year. So a third potential risk is the return of the land swap idea. This, in a way, fits within the broader idea of Trump's administration to be invested in pushing for quick deals to claim credit as a peacemaker. And this again means prioritizing the optics of success over sustainable long-term progress. And we'll remember that back in 2020, former White House National Security Advisor John Bolton actually stated that the U.S. Would not stand in the way if both parties to the dispute reached a mutually satisfactory agreement. But this brings us to the fact that the U.S. administration might play into Serbia's hands by pushing Albin Kurti to de-escalate tensions in northern Kosovo and even put additional pressure for him to establish the association of Serb majority municipalities. And the fourth and the last potential risk is decreased U.S. military presence in the region. Particularly, this could affect a NATO-led KFOR mission, but also EU4 Althea, because without coordinated American backing, key rule of law reforms, anti-corruption measures, media freedom, among others, could stall, and this would consequently weaken European deterrence against Russian and Chinese influence, but also the country's advancement towards the European Union. And now to conclude, actually, what does this mean for the EU foreign policy for the region? Well, there are certain deterrence mechanisms that you could deploy in this case. Firstly, what I think would be very wise is that those EU governments ready to act should coordinate a unified response to preemptively condemn politicians that are emboldened by Trump 2.0 national rhetoric. The more, the merrier. And this requires strategic communication and swift public rebuttals, especially against moves such as the All-Serbian declaration that I mentioned. Secondly, previous efforts to impose EU-wide sanctions have failed, often relying on US initiatives that were later backed by the UK and Germany, as we saw in Republika Srpska. So member states should coordinate with allies to sanction destabilizing actions, to sanction secessionist moves, and even to impose their different kinds of sanctions, such as we've seen, but very sporadically, asset freeze, travel bans, and also all different kinds of restrictions that is in our hands. Thirdly, reduced US military presence would create a security vacuum, and that would test the EU's capacities to uphold stability. So the EU should prepare now and should respond swiftly by actually deploying additional troops to KFOR and EU4 LTA. And last but not the least, also that was mentioned previously by my colleagues, the EU should build alliances with allies beyond its border. I just named the example of the UK because after Banska attack, the UK increased its KFOR presence. The UK has been focused on countering foreign interference, on fostering democracy, on strategic investments as well. And just recently, a few weeks ago, the country signed new agreements with Serbia, North Macedonia, and Kosovo to combat people smuggling and enhance border security. And all of this very much actually aligns with the EU goals for a regional stability. So last sentence from my side, I would like to underline the following, and this is that it will be increasingly difficult and very challenging to fill the void left by genuine American disengagement if that happens. Yet we should not forget that it is the EU that Western Balkans countries look to, each for their own reasons, but it is the EU that holds the keys to the progress. And in a way, we should not forget that even when discussing EU transatlantic relations. That's all for me, Giuseppe, for now. Thank you.
And thank you, Bojana. And again, you were excellent in highlighting certain features of the region, which to me sound a lot like features that we see elsewhere. Feature for the will for a quick deal, the potential emboldening of authoritarians, and the relevance for the EU to work with partners. This is extremely important, and I thank you for that. And now let's move on to EUISS, last but certainly not least, and we focus on the issue of economic security, which has been a key theme of EU-US relations in recent years. It has become a key theme of the G7 and beyond. And we know that this administration will focus squarely on reindustrialization, bringing back manufacturing. And you wrote a piece which is actually forthcoming as part of our series on engaging the Trump's team to boost industrial capacity outside Russia and China. This will be published tomorrow, most likely. So give us a little preview. What is the outlook for manufacturing, and why is it so important for the EU to get its act together when dealing with Trump?
Yeah, thank you very much, Giuseppe. I mean, my main point in the commentary is that the EU should work as soon as possible with the Trump team to boost industrial capacity, specifically outside of China and Russia. And the reason I think that is because really the main security threat that I see to both the EU and the US in this sense of a connected theater is the enormous concentration of both fighting capability, but also especially the manufacturing capability and the control over critical economic inputs, such as all sorts of materials and metals that enable that fighting capability in this sort of emerging anti-Western axis, whatever we want to call it, in Iran, North Korea, China, and Russia. And for all its vices and for all the disagreements that we have with the Trump administration on the goals that should be achieved, for instance, in Ukraine, for instance, in bilateral trade, I think the Trump administration and several of its would-be members, such as Albert Colby, but also of its already members, such as Marco Rubio, I think they understand the gist of the problem, which is that the reindustrialization of the G7 plus partners has led to an enormous gap, a deterrence gap in terms of the amount of stuff we actually can produce that is needed to both maintain our defense and our power, our military power, as well as to remain our critical sectors at a time where either China or in the past already Russia may weaponize interdependencies against us. And with these critical sectors, I mean the medical sector. What's far less often mentioned is that all these rare earths and these critical minerals we talk about, they're not just for the energy transition. It's a critical sector problem across critical sectors. Defense, medical, telecommunications, everything you hold dear, basically. China has a pretty strong lock, has a pretty strong levers it can pull to make our life very difficult. And in this sense, taking this view on actually how the Trump administration can increase the capabilities, the manufacturing capabilities and the production of these critical economic inputs, I'm quite convinced quite a lot will happen. There are a few things constant in Trump's thinking, but you can really go back 30 years. And the decline of manufacturing is stable. He mentioned it first in the big Bloomberg interview he did on the US economy once. On the podcast with Joe Rogan, he went on about how the US has great raw earth materials that he will finally be able to delve because he's going to push all the environmental considerations out of the way. And the aforementioned 𝐂𝐨𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬 has 200 times less shipbuilding capability than China, even though what they're engaged in East Asia is a maritime competition. Well, another statement he made recently, which may be a bit more hyperbolic and may not be as extreme as he puts it, but he says that Russia basically came out of the Ukraine conflict with the revved up defense industry, producing ammunition by a factor 2 to 3 larger than the transatlantic alliance. Well, the gap may not be quite as extensive. We had internal discussions about this, but the gap is there, and this is very serious. And I think the West has not yet left the mindset of a sort of conflict that is really the conflict of the post-Cold War era. That's the sort of conflict that can be used against rogue states, for instance, Saddam's Iraq, when in 1990 he invaded Kuwait and he needed to be expelled, but purely on the basis of technological dominance and purely on the basis of air superiority, etc., you can evict the other power. I think great power competition is fundamentally about something else. It's yes about out-innovating the other party militarily, but deterrence as much rests on your capability to produce. And I think the Ukraine war has certainly showed this. Well, China still refines more than 90% of all rare earths needed throughout a whole range of defense systems. This goes for many other products. Think of antimony, something that's specifically used to harden ammunition, and all sorts of other products. And across the board, if we just look at the general statistics, in 1995, the EU and the US still manufactured 9 times more together than China did. And today, China out-manufactures us, and really by a wide margin. So this is how the balance has shifted. This is how it connects to actual fighting capability and to what I think is really the future of, in Europe, credibly being able to deter Russia, and in East Asia, being able to credibly deter China, also around Taiwan. What you see on the other side is that there's not just this manufacturing capability, but there's a very smart division of labor that has worked as a force multiplier for this emerging anti-Western axis. So if we look at Russia, I mean, Russia has got a lot of drones from Iran. It gets fighting power and actual manpower from Korea. It gets enormous amounts of ammunition. If we have to believe the South Korean defense chief, it's really millions of shells that have been delivered to North Korea, etc. Basically, 2 isolated sanctioned war economies that can bear the brunt of additional Western sanctions because they're sanctioned already. They don't mind doing the dirty work. But at the same time, China has been able to basically backfill all the dual-use goods that Russia needs to maintain its own domestic defense industry, either whether this is re-export via microelectronics from the West or domestically produced in China. So you see a force multiplying effect. Through this division of labor, China evades being sanctioned by the G7 because it can say, well, we didn't supply any actual weapons, even though the effect is the same. Russia maintains its fighting capability. North Korea becomes a more potent threat because in exchange, Russia delivers high tech in terms of the military realm to North Korea. And Russia, of course, maintains its fighting capability, and with the North Korean support, it then avoids or makes it more likely that it can avoid another round of very unpopular and potentially dangerous conscription at home. This base of stuff, at the same time, we see China is far less generous with what it's providing to the West, or to the G7 plus partners, or may soon not be willing to provide anymore. And I'll pick out one example, except for all the export restrictions we've already seen on material exports, and the actual reduction of the exports of unwrought gallium and germanium needed for defense sectors and semiconductors to the US, Japan, and the Netherlands, basically to zero of the unwrought product. China has built the capability to be able to pull out the rug from underneath our reindustrialization, defense, and deterrence efforts. And in small scale, we already seen this. China put a ban on delivering components, batteries, and such to a US drone maker, 𝐂𝐤𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬 civilian supplies as well to Taiwan. After China banned the supply of these components, this company is now facing major production constraints. And I really advise anyone interested in the larger question of deterrence and defense industrial base and defense industrial sub-base, which I think is really where the problem is, to look at this case, because this is what, if you implement this on a bigger scale, what really can happen. So, well, moving on, what to do about this. I think the reindustrialization push in the US should be seen as exciting. Not just exciting, it tackles a real problem that underpins what I think is the main security threat to us, namely the concentration of fighting capability, production capability, and control over economic inputs in this anti-Western axis. But it's not just a goal. It is something that, with the sort of radical approach that will have all sorts of negative externalities, the expansion of energy production, the cutting of environmental regulation, the abandoning of climate targets, that in other fields has clear externalities and negative sides, but it will be something that will help the US actually achieve these sorts of things. And you have to contrast that with the limitations we have ourselves. One, our prices for electricity are 2 to 3 times higher than the US. Our natural gas prices are 4 to 5 times higher. And in all these other categories, in terms of domestic energy production, we barely do that. We're dependent on volatile international energy markets. And we have very stringent regulations and targets, both in terms of climate and the environment. So, yes, I would like to have this reindustrialization rather take place at home for security purposes. But given these constraints, I think it's more likely that you'll end up the US making far bigger steps. And finally, to conclude, what I think we should do is engage, just like Tim said, the Trump administration early and focus on an industrial pact. And I don't just mean an economic pact, I mean an industrial pact. Specifically looking, what do we lack in terms of maintaining our own critical sectors and maintaining our own capability to deter both in Europe and in the Indo-Pacific, and make sure that everything we can do in terms of public procurement and other measures, we steer that towards each other. We make sure that, for instance, the opening of new mines, new refining capability is actually promoted in like-minded countries and not further strengthens basically the 4 countries I measured before. I really fear if we don't do this early, the Trump administration will move on unilaterally. Peace through strength is the motto. And I think that especially the security hawks that he has, they will insist that trade and industrial policy will be even shaped more towards the sense of building up the security, building up the defense industrial subbase, than the overall trade regime. So I think they'll prioritize that.
Excellent. Thank you, EUISS. Again, I've heard some of the similar themes as before. Act early, act in unity, take radical decisions that are necessary. And in all this area, even in this field of manufacturing that has now become the foundation, or maybe it has always been, but we have rediscovered it as so important to our capacity to defend ourselves at the end of the day. That's it. We see the need to find an agreement with the Trump administration and with the US. Now, we have good 15 minutes for question, and I've seen a lot of questions coming in from our chat. Let's start The first one that I've seen was from Pelin Yücel, who asks, during the first Trump presidency, there were serious tensions between the USA and the EU in terms of security and economic issues. Do you think that this relationship in the second Trump term will be more negotiable than the previous one with regard to the current geopolitical situation? I would suggest I will give a first answer from my side. I believe that then, since there's an element of economic relationship, maybe Joris could say something about it. But of course, here, security and economic issues were key during the first term as well. Now, the question, there is an area that we haven't discussed that much, which is the potential for transatlantic tension in trade between the EU and the US, with Trump imposing tariff on Europe as well. And that's something that the EU has been concerned about for a while. My assessment is that for that, the EU is ready than in other areas to play ball with Trump, in the sense of potentially showing that the EU has capabilities to counter some sanctions, some tariffs that the US would impose. It has the precedent of the first term in which the EU did respond to the tariffs that the US imposed on steel, and then with the Boeing Airbus case. And therefore, that area is an area in which the EU could quickly show to the United States that it can hurt the US back. And therefore, that could be a potential for some sort of resolution of it. But maybe I'm not an expert on it. On security, I see less bargaining power on our side. It's simply about showing to the United States that we're serious about defending the European continent, and otherwise the United States will move away. And that's it's basically, if the Trump's threats are real, that they will move away from Europe no matter what, then the EU must be ready to fill in those forces, work to produce the weaponry that is necessary for the NATO defense and deterrence plans, work with the United Kingdom, work with other non-EU NATO allies to strengthen our capacity for producing, and showing to the United States that we are ready to take this challenge. Joris, do you want to add anything to this?
No, I think I'll take the next question.
Okay, thank you. Okay, then I move to the second question, which is from Emilia Niaksu from the EUISS, asking, how should the EU leverage its economic and regulatory power to counterbalance disruptions in the transatlantic alliance while ensuring strategic autonomy? Briefly, considering the EU foreign policy framework, what structural and strategic adjustments are necessary to mitigate the risk of US disengagement under Trump's leadership? And how could the EU recalibrate its approach to global diplomacy and alliances, particularly with powers like China and Russia? So, since I've spoken before, I would then let Joris speak, and then I would ask Tim to comment on the China angle of this question.
Yeah, many thanks. That's a very big question, and one that can encompass an entire webinar by itself. I think on the previous point, this sort of retaliation through our own tariffs is probably necessary. I agree with that, but if you take a step back, I still think the real security issue towards the EU is twofold. One is the actual military security threat that comes from Russia, and by extension, the sort of deterrence vacuums that we might find if something happens in the Balkans. And two, the enormous disruption that we might face if there is a military conflict in East Asia, combined with a weaponization of interdependence, because you end up in some sanctions power with China on the one hand and the US and the EU on the other hand. So this is really where I personally think that the real problems lie, more than even in the bilateral relationship, which, I mean, will be a distraction. And if there will be tariffs, we'll have to respond and retaliate. But I would still prefer to take that bigger threat, that military sort of threat by Russia, and the economic security threat indirectly from China, first. And then in terms of regulatory capabilities, what I would hope the EU would do is work with the US to change a lot of the clauses that we have, for instance, in stuff like public procurement. So what I now find, if I still talk to individual member states about the clauses they have, for instance, in wind turbines, in which an enormous amount of rare earths and these permanent magnets are needed. This public procurement is still all about price and about the environment. It doesn't have geopolitical clauses that actually stimulate supply in trusted places. So what I'd much rather have is that at a very early stage, we engage the Americans, not just the Americans. We do this together with other like-minded countries, as Giuseppe said, who have the same problems. And we create a market that within that market of South Korea, Japan, the EU, the United Kingdom, the US, etc., we try to see whether we can generate supply for a lot of these critical economic inputs here, so that if there's either a crisis in East Asia or our problems with Russia escalate, we'll have a much stronger sort of deterrence and fighting capability ourselves and much more control over our own critical sectors.
Tim, would you like to add to this?
Yes, absolutely. I would like to pick up the last bit of the question that was raised, because it sounds a bit like, I mean, it asks whether we should change our diplomatic approach, particularly towards countries like China and Russia. If that implies that we should change it in the way that we should be sort of more accommodating with these countries, I think then the question is absolutely not. I mean, the challenges that Russia and China pose for Europe have not changed a single bit with the election of Donald Trump. So I think I mean, I'm not sure that was implied, but I think maybe it is good, because in fact what we could see from several parts of Europe is sort of a renewed call for something that is frequently referred to as equidistant, that sort of the challenge that a Trump administration in Washington poses is equal to that of Russia and China. And that, I think, is a misunderstanding or misreading of the situation. I mean, Russia, I think it's very clear and very present. A second bit that I think is important here is that we might face a situation where Trump tries to realign with Russia to try and drive a wedge between the two authoritarian countries. That would be also a nightmare, because we would be a bit left left alone with the Russian threat that is a more direct and immediate threat to European security, because I think still sort of whatever we consider in terms of however important economic security is, and I agree with EUISS and others, of course, that it is a central piece, but I mean, you always start sort of with the physical security, the national security in our country. So Russia really features, I guess, first for us, but I think, firstly, I'm very doubtful you can drive a wedge between Russia and China. And second, even if you could, it would not be to the EU's benefit. So I think, for a good reason, the perception of China has fundamentally changed, or at least the change has been accelerated by China's support for Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine over the last few years. So I think, so in that sense, I think the change is not so much in our diplomacy towards those two countries. Though I would agree that I believe that there will be sort of an interest from the Chinese side to explore where we diverge and where we differ from the United States. And there are these differences. So on instrumental smaller items, I think it may be possible to sort of exploit the Chinese willingness to cooperate more deeply with us. But on the big picture, I think the situation in our relations with those two countries hasn't really changed. We are rather sort of facing the threat of a US-Russian alignment of some sort. Finally, I think where the diplomatic differences are more present is indeed, and that has been mentioned by several of you already, but I need to sort of re-emphasize that maybe, is indeed with allies and partners. I mean, we should have done this before. And even if with the Harris administration, we should have deepened alliances and partners in the region, Japan, Australia, you name it, like South Korea, quite a few. But that, of course, becomes even more urgent the moment that you face a question mark in the transatlantic relationship.
Thank you, Tim, and yours. Very excellent response, and I agree with the importance of maintaining, being clear-eyed about the threats that we face that have not gone away. They are growing even more significant. For the last 5 minutes, I would like to pass the floor to Bojana, since there are two questions specific on the Western Balkans, and I'll ask them at the same time. One asks, do you think financial support for Western Balkan economic development could be affected as well? I assume by the changes in the Trump administration. And then there's another question on the risk of nationalist rhetoric in Western Balkans, especially Serbia, becoming even more aggressive after the US election, which I think is very real compared based on what Bojana said before. And the question is, what is the way for us, for the EU, other policy analysts, and other stakeholders to coordinate response that EU nations could implement? Bojana, this is for you.
Thank you for both questions, actually. On the first, financial support, I see it highly unlikely that the support for the economic development of the region will be affected, particularly given the EU's commitment to the region through the growth plan for the Western Balkans up to 2027, because this plan actually signals the EU's long-term commitment to supporting stability and prosperity in the region. And even if Trump administration were to shift its focus towards securing more business deals or resource-based project, which is highly likely to happen because this is just a continuation of his first term, I believe that the EU, it's a fact that the EU remains by far the most important trade and investment partner for the Balkans. And this dynamic is unlikely to change because, if anything, particularly now, the EU should seize this moment to double down on its enlargement agenda and really pursue it fiercely, but of course with a merit-based approach, particularly when it comes to the funds that are allocated through the new growth plan. And only with such an approach, the EU could ensure that its influence remains central to the region's future. But again, I would not see that any financial support is in danger. And this is actually a very positive development from that. On the second question, what can we do? I mentioned briefly today throughout the intervention, but also in my commentary, I do believe that consistent and targeted strategic communication is essential. For policy analysts and experts, it means producing materials, be it policy briefs or other recommendations with the same messages, basically amplifying the message and the danger of nationalist rhetoric, but not only for the Western Balkans, but also for the EU stability and security, because this is something that we often oversee and we look at within the regional terms, whereas it's very important for the EU also to tackle these challenges so that it does not transcend the borders. And this would help build unified front. And it is not only, in my view, about reaction, but it is about preemptively addressing the risks and making the cost of nationalist rhetoric clear to leaders who might consider pursuing it. This is crucial, and this is, of course, more on the EU side rather than on the side of other actors, such as academia or civil society actors. And maybe second, and again, more for the EU, would be leveraging the new growth plan for the Western Balkans, which actually offers a concrete tool to address all of these challenges. And by linking financial support and development assistance to clear merit-based progress in democratic governance, in regional cooperation, in reconciliation, actually the EU could counterbalance the rise of nationalist narratives. And this message should be clear. It should be more clear than it was, because there are tangible rewards for constructive behavior, and also there should be severe consequences for actions that undermine EU integration. And we should be very unified on that front on behalf of the EU.
Thank you very much, Bojana, for giving some reminder that we have tools, and by working together, the EU can still provide security to its neighbors and to themselves. I'm afraid we are almost out of time. There is one last question on Trump's assessments for the end of the war in Ukraine. I'm afraid that we don't have time to answer it right now, but I just encourage you to go read the commentary that Andrej, Dietrich, and I have written as part of the series on specifically on Trump and Ukraine for some pointers in that towards that answer. Let me then conclude this event by thanking you all for staying here with us for this very interesting discussion. We know that managing transatlantic relations will be one of the, if not the foreign policy challenge of 2025. And it's important to discuss it and to act on it. Thank you to Tim, Bojan, and Joris for sharing your expertise. I want to also thank you, Fanny and Rada, for supporting us today from a technical standpoint. And once again, thank you to the great audience for the engagement and the questions. Make sure to check out the commentary series on the website, as well as the many publications that our colleagues produce. And stay tuned for future EUISS events. Thank you very much, and have a good rest of the day.